I got the countdown. All right. Good morning. It is May the 5th, 2024. And this is the Odessa Wesleyan Church. This is our journey through the Bible. And we are moving to a new epic, a movement in history. And we're in epic number 3 now. So we're going to look at Exodus chapter 1 this week. I know I said Exodus chapter 2, and I know I keep doing this each week, but then I go back and I start studying the scripture a little bit during the week and realize that by the time I get to about 6 pages of notes, that's way too much to cover in 45 minutes, so I kind of cut it off. So I apologize. Sometimes it's good. It's okay to read the scriptures more than once a week. So I think that's a good practice. So time period as far as we can. If you have a map or that picture we posted at the beginning of the timeline, and as far as biblical history versus the history of humankind, we're about 1500 to 1200 BC. So about 1500 years, 1200 years before the birth of Christ. Now, the reason, again, is for that time gap, where exactly we are, is I think I mentioned this before, but as far as dates and times and years, remember that our actual calendar that we have now is actually a European invention back centuries ago. Before that, every culture had their own timeline, and a lot of them based it upon the cycle of the moon. Now, the cycle of the moons are 28 days. So if you don't have, and so 12 cycles of the moon doesn't equal 365 days. So there's that. And there's also, again, remember that as far as exact, so and so did such and such on this day at this time this year, again, is kind of more of a quote unquote modern historical record. That so to try to pinpoint when exactly things happen is a little difficult. And also, there's some different views as far as timeline, as far as biblical accounts where this happened, where it happened. There's about a 200 to 300 year gap. So that's why sometimes when we cite we are in this range, I'm not going to take one side or the other. As far as that, I don't think that takes away from the message. You know, of what we need to focus on. So that's what we're going to focus on is the message, and that's why you'll hear me everyone. Okay. So through God's intervention, there was a great famine. It's just cutting in. Okay, here we go. You can hear me, but we're also recording it on our YouTube, so we need the other mic. I apologize for that. So Joseph's life was interrupted, and he was sent to Egypt as a slave, and we talked about that the last couple of weeks. How through God's intervention, this awful thing that happened to Joseph that enabled not just his family to be saved from starvation and the ramifications of the famine, but also the modern world at that time. That Egypt was one of the nations that for if you look and say, wow, they were kind of smart to take this land, this plenty for 7 years and store it up, and not only were able to feed their people but everybody else's. But when we look at the biblical narrative, it wasn't just intelligent leadership. It was because God used the events of Joseph's life to bring him to that place. So Israel was brought to back to Egypt, reunited with his son, and all the sons and all their families, their servants, settled. in a section of Egypt called Goshen. The Pharaoh literally handed them over. This is how Joseph was at the time. The king of Egypt gave these quote unquote foreigners a section of his country to make their own. So they settled there. So Israel passed away, and he made his sons promise him to carry him back to the cave that his grandparents, his parents, his wife were buried at. The very same cave that Abraham had purchased there. Now, they did something else. The famine was still going on. They returned back to Egypt. And this is the account, the last account here of Joseph we have. I'm going to go back a little bit to chapter 50 of Genesis. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and also the children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you out of this land that he promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath, God will surely come to your aid, but then you must carry my bones from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So when Joseph died, he had his brothers, his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, his family swear an oath, make a promise to him that when they left Egypt, that he would not be buried there, that he would also be buried in his land of his fathers. Even though he died at 110 years old, he came to Egypt at 17, countless times more. In essence, he could have said, well, I'm an Egyptian, I'm going to live here. But no, he remembered that he was still one of God's chosen people. So notice that he said here something odd, though. Hopefully you didn't miss it when I read it. He said it twice. God will surely come to your aid. Now, why is he saying that? Joseph is still the leader, in essence, that he's second in command of Egypt. That his family is honored, that they're prospering, they're in a stable environment. Why would he say that? That God will come to your aid. I think that God gave Joseph some insight that things were going to change for his family, that they will come to a point where they're not honored, they're not even seen as residents of Egypt, that they are going to become enslaved. So we're now moving into the next movement of the story of how God relates to humanity. The focus now is going to be moving from, remember we started, way back in Genesis, we started with the focus being on, the early human beings, Adam and Eve and their descendants. And then we moved to Noah. And then we kind of, humanity expanded. And then it seems like we're always focusing on Abraham and then on Isaac and on Jacob, who, God changed his name to Israel, on a family or on individuals. Well, now the focus is going to move from a family to a nation, a great people. But God still is living out that theme that we said that this journey is all about. That God still is intent on the redemption of humanity from the death grip of sin. That sin separates us from our relationship we created, and God desires to have us with. And so the theme continues, that not just on a specific group, but now on this nation, it will continue to expand as we continue our journey through the Bible. Exodus reminds us of a theme that we keep seeing in our study here, that God loves us so much that he wants a relationship with us, and he will do a great work to bring us back to him. That's a big amen. So we have 400 years of silence. It doesn't really, again, say that. But if you match up the biblical narrative with biblical history and human history, you'll see that 400 years later, Exodus chapter 1 appears. Again, we don't, how can you prove that? We can get into that, but 100 years there, and something changed. That after 400 years, that you notice there in the words that Joseph is forgotten about. Another Pharaoh comes and is forgotten, about Joseph. And the Hebrews, the Israelites, become enslaved. Well, how did this happen? How do you go from being descendants of a man who literally saved the world through his God-given abilities and his talents and his place to all of a sudden now you're slaves? Well, for more than a couple centuries, Egypt was ruled by the Hebrew people. Now, this sounds very similar to the Hebrew, it's just a little bit different spelling. Initially, this group was a foreign nomadic tribe of raiders. That's what they did, is they would just rush through. All of a sudden, one day you're harvesting your crops, and the next day, these nomadic raiders are storming through, and they're stealing your crops, and stealing your slaves, and stealing your wives and your daughters, and then they move on. They really didn't settle. They just kept going. Well, they were also, in a way, intelligent enough, they would take advantage of things. Well, during this time period, just before Joseph, that Egypt was in a turmoil. It was in a great civil war. And what initially was the dynasty of Egypt at the time was fracturing, falling apart. And these Hebrew raiders appeared in Egyptian history. And they conquered the land. They took advantage of the unrest and they took over Egypt. And the unique thing is they were very similar in ethnicity, in their language roots, to the family of Jacob, what would become the Israelites. And so they assimilated very easily into this country. Now, the unique thing with Egyptian history is that the basic tenets of Egyptian history, its religion, its culture, its terms for, and somewhat its written language, stayed the same. But to say, Egyptian just means you're living there. That in a way, they were kind of like an early American culture. That we had different skin colors, different religions, different viewpoints, different ways we rear our family. We have different dialects, accents. In our language, the Egyptians were very much the same way. But they kept the tenets, the core as far as the religion. They would seem to assimilate some of their beliefs into the Egyptian religion. So keep that in mind because Egypt's going to, play a big role throughout the biblical narrative. That Egyptian isn't, the typical Hollywood, viewpoint of, oh, this is Egyptian. Really not, because over its time, it's taken different roles. Fast forward way, way, way ahead, some of the criticisms of modern criticisms of the movie Cleopatra that, Elizabeth Taylor started. Oh, well, that's not accurate because she looked at European. Actually, it is. That Elizabeth Taylor, her character, looks more like what Cleopatra did than movies that came after. The reason why is at that time, the Greek culture break off of Alexander the Great's invasion of the Middle East and of Egypt, and the Roman Empire's influence to the north across the sea. You had people of more that ethnicity ruling Egypt, even though they were Egyptian, that they were, culturally, or not culturally, but ethnicity wise different. So you have these Hebrew people, they're ruling. That's why they assimilated very easily to the Israelites. And that's where the Israelites would adopt this term Hebrew because they kept to that culture. Well, what happened was, again, history of Egypt, another war happened. And another power came to place, pushed out the Hebrews, Joseph's descendants, in Goshen. They kind of stuck to themselves. Well, as the powers that came into Egypt, as they solidified around probably about 1096 BC, we really see some strong evidence that they start to rise up as a power, that they pushed this group out that were the foreign invaders that controlled our country for 100 years. But yet there's this little group over here, these shepherds over here, that are very similar to them. Well, we got a problem. That from all accounts, maybe they remain neutral. We don't really know, but they were the foreigners now. After 400 or more years living there, after their patriarch Joseph saved the Egyptian nation, all that was forgotten in the history because, unfortunately, in history, the winner writes history. So when the Egyptians reunited and were the Egyptians again, we got these Hebrews shoved out of here. I think they erased the history of them. We don't want to admit that, at one point in our history, the great Egypt was so weak that these bunch of, guys riding on camels and donkeys came in and conquered our land and ruled over us. So they looked at the descendants, the Israelites, the Hebrews, and said, oh, these guys, could gather together and they could reconquer our land. So we need to do something about it. So during this time, Egypt would experience great prosperity, both militarily, political might throughout the region, that they would rule from as far west as Libya and as far north as Syria. If you look at a world map, that's a big section, even in the modern day, to rule. But they would have a strong influence within what we would call northern Egypt at the time, and then they had no problem sending their armies as far north into Syria, maybe even into Turkey. Archaeologists have seen evidence of they're there. Under King Thutmose and especially Pharaoh Ramses II, great cities and monuments were built. And we see these today, that the pyramids, that the Sphinx, evidence of a lot of the cities. These were great monuments that these people built. Now we'll get to the reason why here. Let's look at Exodus chapter 1. A couple things we need to point out here. In verses 1 through 5 here, you see that the sons of Israel would become the tribes of Israel. And this, again, is a very important point that's going to go throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament. That each of the sons, their descendants, would be identified by that son's name. And you would have 12 tribes of Israel. What would happen is that that was their identification. That when eventually they re-entered the land of Canaan, the promised land, that each group would settle in a specific area and would become, in essence, a state or province. Not only would you say you're of the tribe of Dan, for example, you were from Dan, that this area that you lived in, you were a part of this family, but this was where you were from. Very much kind of like we have. You could almost, look at in America, you have instead of a state, you have the tribe of New York. That I have shared a funny story about, an area that we used to live in. And I had a gentleman that lived there for 12 years and said, how they identify, me? And I'm like, no. He goes, well, that's Frank from New York. I said, but you've married a local girl, you teach at the local school, you've raised a family. And he goes, uh-huh. And I'm from New York. Even though if you talk to this gentleman, Frank, who has since passed away, you would swear that he was a local. Now, I'm not going to tell you where, because if somebody's from that area, I'm not insulting you. I'm just giving a cultural. And so, he was identified, even though he was born in New York State. He moved to this other state. The locals there, even his family, identified him as somebody after 12 years of being from there. So that's kind of how we have is you have your identity, and so the tribes of Israel, that their identity of who was their what tribe they descended from. So eventually each tribe would take on a unique characteristic and have a role in the nation. So that's very important. Keep that in mind as we look through it, Exodus, and as well as we look to when they eventually come into their own in the promised land. In verses 6 through 10, this group grew to very large. That when the new leaders came to power, they saw these people as a threat because of their numbers and also because they were allied with the Hebrew invaders. And again, the tendency of humanity is that when you have, when things are settled and peace is settled, that you label, the ones who, were defeated, as still your enemies. That you would think that we would have peace and we would try to restore things. Well, initially, that doesn't happen. So, Egyptian history tells us, that this era that we're in, and if you look at starting there at verse 11, that this is when we start to see the temples and the pyramids and the monuments and the great cities being built. But Egyptian history doesn't tell us how they were built. They were built on the backs of forced labor and enslavement. Now remember how this started. This a negative result of Joseph's administration was the common people gave up everything in order to be fed. Going back to Genesis 47 here, starting at verse 20. So Joseph bought up all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servanthood from one end to Egypt and another. So, what would happen in Egyptian society was that two groups would emerge. You would have the elite groups of rulers, military leaders, and priests that were very prosperous. And then you'd have everybody else. And everybody else was, in essence, a slave. That maybe, to match that with European history, that everybody else was a serf, that they had their quote unquote land, but the pharaoh still owned that. And their purpose in life was to feed and prosper Pharaoh first and then take care of their bare essence needs. That if you look at the great monuments, and again, people will say, well, there's no, account of Egyptian, slavery. No, there's not, because again, these select groups, you had a very small minority of the population that was in charge, and everybody else was a servant or literally no rights, no nothing, no ownership or anything, that everything they did benefited the pharaoh. So no, there wasn't, in essence, slavery like we would say, that happened unfortunately, in American history, where you had vast majority of one race and a small majority of slaves. That there it was the opposite. You had a very, very small minority of masters, and everybody else who wasn't a master was a slave. So that's why Egyptian history doesn't mention slaves. So the people existed to build these monuments, to Pharaoh. And so the reason, um, I'm sorry, I went ahead of my notes. Throughout human history, unfortunately, we see this happen. No justification for it. That unfortunately, one of our unfortunate tendencies as human beings use and abuse each other for selfish benefit. And that is so unfortunate and should never, ever happen. Unfortunately, sometimes we've justified that through religion, and that should not happen. That no religion, no matter what it's called, has the right to justify, using another, for their own selfish benefit. In God's eyes, there's no difference between skin color, hair color, language, nationhood. That you're all equal. We're all equal in God's eyes. So the key to preventing things like this from happening in human history is that humanity needs to return to the point of God's viewpoint of human beings. That every life is valuable. That the weaker need to be protected by the stronger, not manipulated, not controlled, not to be owned. That those who have been blessed by God through prosperity, through talent, through wisdom, through freedom, they need to take that and apply that. Their responsibility is to go and support the weaker one and to protect them from those who don't follow God's viewpoint. See, God strongly despises those who oppress others. And people will argue maybe it's prosperity. Well, prosperity is not necessarily the problem. The problem is when we human beings forget the ultimate root reason why we have prosperity, God's blessing. And if we forget that, and our intention is to be so greedy that we want more than we have, and we'll do anything, even on the backs of other people's, to build our monuments, to build our great cities, that we'll find anything is justifiable to infringe on the rights of others in order to enrich ourselves. Excuse me. So the key is to return to God's view of humanity. And it's very clearly put in the Bible that each and every human being is a creation of God, made in God's image, and therefore we need to protect that. So we have Egypt transitioning to a new people group, and they see the Hebrews, the Israelites, as enemies of the nation. So no matter what they do, they enslave them, they make their work hard. And they seem, for some reason, these people prosper. These people expand. The more and more that they put them under hard labor, the more and more these people have children and their children and their children, and they keep growing instead of these people dying out, which is the intention of the Egyptian rulers. That these people seem to become stronger and they seem to become more and more. So they come up with an idea. The Pharaoh says, well, if we can't work them to death, then let's just eliminate them. So he introduces this idea into Egyptian culture, which unfortunately in humanity, up into our modern age here, that we have seen is infanticide, the killing of the newborn. That simply because of what culture, what race you were born to, that you are worthy or not worthy, depending on who's in charge. So the Egyptian Pharaoh ordered the midwives of the Israelites that if it's a girl child is born, then you allow her to live. If it's a male child, you kill her. The reason is because the idea is that the less males out there, the less that these people are going to reproduce. Now, God values all life. Young, poor, rich, old, doesn't matter. Regardless of gender, regardless of skin color, regardless of nationality, all human life is valued by God. And to take the life of an innocent person is a great sin. Go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, both male and female, he created them. See, every human being is made in the image of God. And for us to purposely harm and kill is to take God's power over life and death. That he is greatly grieved when innocent blood is shed. Let's be reminded what he said in Genesis chapter 4 to Cain after, Cain murdered his brother Abel. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out in the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother and killed him. Then moving down a little bit, the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood." So, and then later on, God sets up the tenets of how to relate to God and how to relate to human beings. In other words, we call these the Ten Commandments. The sixth commandment is simply and strongly worded, "You will not murder." All human life is to be valued, it's precious, and it's to be protected. So God has a very strong view on taking of innocent life. And the Israelite midwives, even though they were ordered to kill innocent life, that to obey them, to obey Pharaoh's directives, that would save them from judgment. Because if they refused, outright refused, Pharaoh could have killed them and found new midwives. To disobey, they face judgment by God. And sometimes that happens in our own life. That sometimes we're going to be challenged to obey man's directives, to obey what it seems popular, seems easy, or to obey God's laws, which could put us in relational, physical jeopardy with other human beings. We need to realize that always we need to go God's way. Not saying this is easy choice. You can imagine that these two midwives, the fear that was in their minds. And it's not always a positive result. Not saying that if you do good that life will be lollipops and nice little songs. It's not always going to be. What matters is the blessing that comes from following God before the approval of others, or even for the sake of our very lives. That sometimes is the call that we're put up against. That do we follow what is popular, what is easy, or do we follow God and even risk our very lives, our very prosperity, our very place in the community? The plan didn't work out for Pharaoh so well. That it seemed like every time that a woman goes into labor and it's a male child, the midwives weren't there. They already born. Well, what do you want me to do? The baby's suckling at her, at his mother's breast. You want me to rip that child from him? I can't do that. I don't know what to tell you, Pharaoh. So then Pharaoh goes another step. He orders that every male baby be disposed of like garbage, thrown into the Nile, drowned. Helpless babe. Just because you're a male Hebrew descendant, throw them out. Helpless, innocent children sacrificed. And unfortunately, we will see this over and over and over in human history. That the easiest, most convenient way for evil to happen is when the innocent, especially innocent children, are sacrificed on the altar of convenience. So we have Egypt trapped in slavery, under active annihilation tactics, seemingly abandoned by God. Israel's in a great need of rescue. So what happens now? We kind of are going to pause here for a minute. I know we talked about going into chapter 2, but I think this is a good point, to settle on. That take with you the sense of where Egypt is this week, or where the Israelites are this week. They're enslaved. They're in a foreign land, no longer around people of similar language, culture, who value them, who celebrated what their God did. They're basically looked at as nothing. Their children are at risk of dying, of being killed. And now what? Sometimes in our own life, we could seem like we're far from God, that circumstances in our life are just so overwhelming. How can we go on? But I'll leave you with this. God's about to move in a great way in the Israelites, a great way. And when you're in the same situation, keep praying, keep living, keep trusting, because God's about to move in a great way in your life as well. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for who you are. We thank you no matter where we are, that you have moved in history and you are continuing to move in our lives. Lord, sometimes doing right is harder than doing the easy, popular thing. But Lord, you have called us, especially those who have given our lives to you, to live for you in the face of the darkness of our society. Give us that strength and power to live for you. And Lord, those who are struggling and looking at the things of our society and making a choice, Lord, give us that choice to realize that if we turn to you, you will hear our cry and you will bring us back to you. In your name, amen. Next week, we're going to start chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. And we will probably continue at least a couple chapters in there. You guys have a very good week.